Hi, and thanks for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. When overabundant in water, phosphorus becomes a pollutant that we like to remove to protect water quality. Phosphorus is found in many different types of compounds, and the ease of removing it from waters and wastewaters depends on the compounds to which it is attached. Some of these compounds are soluble in water and some are not. Some are readily removed from water using conventional treatment processes, and others are more recalcitrant to these treatments. Today, we are focused on how we can remove soluble forms of phosphorus that resist conventional treatment, or so-called soluble non-reactive phosphorus. A new paper in the Journal of Environmental Chemical Engineering investigates the proportion of soluble non-reactive phosphorus in municipal and industrial wastewater streams and describes combining two techniques called electrooxidation and ion exchange to convert soluble non-reactive phosphorus into more recoverable forms and then recover it. We're joined today by one of the lead investigators from that study, Dr. Brooke of Marquette University. Brooke, thanks so much for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. Maybe you could take a moment to introduce your team and talk about where your funding comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Matt, for having us on. It's a pleasure to talk on behalf of my full team, which includes a fantastic team of researchers from across disciplines and universities. So we have Cynthia Malik and myself from Marquette University, and Mohammed Hussein and Arash Takshi from University of South Florida, as well as Doug Call from North Carolina State University. And it was pretty great to get these folks together through funding that was supported by the STEPS, the Science and Technologies for Phosphorus Sustainability Center, to be able to actually do this interdisciplinary research.
Great. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and just launch into your presentation, I can ask questions along the way if they come up.
Okay, awesome. All right, so it's a pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about our team's research that was focused on this topic of the challenge of non reactive phosphorus. And specifically, we were thinking about this in terms of a wastewater treatment context. So, is it in wastewater? How much is there? And then, what do we do with it in terms of can we improve removal and recoverability? And so, we focused on a technology called electrooxidation to do this in this study. So, the basis that really drove this research was recognizing that there's all sorts of different phosphorus species. So, a lot of times I think we tend to talk about total phosphorus or orthophosphate, also known as soluble reactive phosphorus. And sometimes that's the largest fraction, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's all sorts of other types that can be particulate form or soluble form, they can be reactive or non reactive. And the form of that phosphorus really dictates what happens to it in nature as well as in environmental engineered systems like wastewater treatment. And we also recognize that the phosphorus can convert back and forth and transform between these different buckets. So, importantly, non-reactive phosphorus, which is tends to be less bioavailable for plants and also less amenable to removal and recovery in wastewater treatment, that can undergo different types of conversion processes to go into the reactive form, which is a little bit more accessible in terms of trying to remove it and recover it so that we can actually get a reusable phosphorus-rich product. So, our research really began with kind of a broad perspective and thinking about a meta analysis of how much non reactive phosphorus is in municipal wastewater. So, we did a study of different wastewater effluents from across the US, and these were gathered from the EPA ECHO database. You can see that a number of the sites that we were able to dig into that you could actually find the total phosphorus numbers, so on the x axis, versus the fraction that was in the non reactive form in the y axis. So if we plot them out this way, the points that are closer to that top diagonal red line have more non-reactive phosphorus in them. And so the reason, again, that that might be important is that if you have more non-reactive phosphorus, that a lot of traditional phosphorus removal technologies might struggle with that. And that can be particularly relevant if you have a facility that has low phosphorus discharge limits. So, for example, in the Everglades region or the Great Lakes region, if they can't get at that non-reactive phosphorus, it could be a challenge for meeting those really low permits.
And
And as we can see, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, sorry, Brooke, just for people who aren't really familiar with log-log plots, I just want to clarify. So the e to the +1, e to the +2, those are all increments of tenfold increases in the amount of phosphorus, right? So that'd be,
Yeah,
yes. Okay.
yeah. Exactly. Thanks for pointing that
And
out.
we do that just to condense the range of data into a graph when data has a very large range.
Yeah, great point. It's huge ranges across here that you can see with
Thanks.
some clusters. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, across that whole range of points that you can see, one of the kind of, I think, interesting findings is that about a third of these facilities that we looked at had their effluent that was primarily in the non-reactive phosphorus form. And so, again, important for discharge limits, important for what happens to that phosphorus afterwards. Even if it's discharged as non-reactive, when it gets into the environment, at some point through different physical and chemical processes, it's going to convert into a reactive form. And so, what happens to it was really our focus here. So, because there is a substantial amount of non reactive phosphorus in different wastewaters and effluents, we thought, hey, is it possible to harness phosphorus transformations to improve removal and recovery? And kind of the basis for that is that there's studies out there that have looked at kind of recalcitrant non-reactive phosphorus forms and how to get rid of them doing things like advanced oxidation. And that can work against really tough compounds like organophosphorus pesticides, for example. But our premise was really about, could we harness some of those processes to have transformation to reactive phosphorus that can then help us to remove and recover that phosphorus? And so, for example, using a process like electrooxidation can assist with an oxidative based transformation of non reactive phosphorus. But past that, we're really interested in the circular economy. So great if we can remove it. This is environmental protection. It's awesome. But is there also a way to recover that phosphorus? So some of the things that we'd looked at had shown that electrooxidation can do this transformation. But if you go all the way to reactive orthophosphate, it's pretty energy intensive. So you're probably not going to operate the process just for that goal. But our question then became, can we operate a process like this with oxidation and give it kind of a little extra zap or a boost so that we get partial oxidation of the non-reactive phosphorus. And then that can then help us with subsequent processes that can remove and recover that phosphorus. So something like ion exchange, for example. And that was really the basis of this study. So we looked at electrooxidation and we examined a few different types of non-reactive compounds. So you see them kind of listed on the left there, a range of organic, inorganic, some different structures. And so when we put those in water and treated them over time with this electrooxidation process, what we see in the graph is that the lines are showing a downward trend, and that's indicating that the non-reactive phosphorus species are going away as we apply more treatment. So that was our goal. They're transforming into different phosphorus compounds. But the other part that you notice on that graph is only three of the compounds that we looked at actually had a pretty substantial decline over time. And that was the subset that's the organic compounds versus the hexametaphosphate and triphosphate at the top, the inorganics. They transformed, but not by very much, even after pretty long extended treatment times. So when you look at the basis for that, it makes pretty good sense with the chemical structure why that happens. So if you think about some of the organic compounds, if you break those bonds apart and release the orthophosphate, the bond energy that's in those molecules is less than if you compare it to some of the inorganic forms. So it's easier to break down, and that makes sense why they're the first to actually start to degrade over time. So one of the other things we did in this study was think about, all right, we're oxidizing these, but what's the mechanism going on in this electrooxidation system? And so we tracked this down with a series of different tests that, in the end, the big indication out of all of them was that there's a direct electron transfer mechanism. The only reason that really is important to us as we think about engineering a system is it could help with the design of the electrooxidation system. So this really tells us the electrode itself matters. We might think about surface area or things like that that could encourage some of that transformation of non-reactive phosphorus. So based on this, again, because we're not going to probably design that system with the primary goal of non-reactive phosphorus transformation, we took the partially oxidized water out of our electrooxidation system and then ran that through a ion exchange process using an ion selective or a phosphorus selective ion exchanger, lane RT. And what we found was that the pre-treatment using electrooxidation did improve phosphorus removal, and therefore it also improved our recovery because that ion exchange is a reversible absorption process. So we can get a pure concentrated form of phosphorus after this that then is able to be reused and in different types of systems. One of the things we found here was that this worked both in lab simple matrices, so water spiked with compounds, but it also worked in a wastewater centrate. But there were two kind of different operational modes in those two waters. So in the lab matrix, there's not very many other competing things, and we saw pretty good transformation. When we threw in the centrate with all sorts of other organics, there's a lot of competition, and it ended up doing not so much the transformation of the non reactive phosphorus, but it still improved our subsequent adsorption. And that's because we reduced all of the other compounds in that system. So, start to get rid of some organics that could interfere or block the ion exchanger. So, overall, it did provide a benefit in both of those water matrices. So at the end of our study, I think the biggest benefit that comes out of this is really knowing more about this forgotten fraction of phosphorus. So how much is out there? Where's it at? We looked at wastewater, but this non-reactive phosphorus can occur throughout the global food system, and it can actually be a substantial fraction of some of the different flows. So knowing that it's there and then understanding what happens to that phosphorus can be a really, really important part of phosphorus management. So in our case, looking at partial transformation can help to improve wastewater treatment in terms of phosphorus removal and recovery. And I think our big message would be it's worth thinking about if there is non reactive phosphorus in the stream that you're interested in, and then how to best go about managing that to meet your goals.
Hey, that's great, Brooke. Thanks so much for that explanation. I wonder, when you compare this approach, this combined approach of electrooxidation and then ion exchange, how does that stack up against, for example, enhanced biological phosphorus removal when it comes to non-reactive phosphorus removal in terms of efficacy, cost, difficulty of operating the systems, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's multifaceted. So if we look at a traditional wastewater treatment like biological or enhanced biological phosphorus removal, it does a pretty great job against, if you think about total phosphorus, the majority that it's tackling is that soluble reactive phosphorus form. So it does a good job against orthophosphate down to a certain level. Um, when it comes to the non-reactive form, those processes tend to struggle a little bit more. And so it seems like it's the fraction that kind of passes through. So it's more difficult to target. So in terms of efficacy, I think there is a difference there. In terms of cost, it goes back to what its target is. So if you're looking at just targeting the orthophosphate fraction, I think your conventional processy like EBPR is going to be a great choice. It's going to be less costly than doing something like advanced oxidation. If you do have this high fraction of non-reactive phosphorus, though, that's where you're going to need maybe a little extra push to be able to get rid of that and remove it out of the system. In terms of the advanced oxidation we've looked at, the energy inputs into it are going to be fairly high, and so doing it just for non-reactive phosphorus is not going to be feasible. But if you're operating something where you already have some sort of high level oxidation process in play, then it's worthwhile thinking about what sort of bang for your buck can you get in terms of how it's going to handle that non-reactive phosphorus.
Yeah, thanks. And so would it make sense to put an electrooxidation process on the front end of an enhanced biological removal process?
I think it would really depend on context. So, if you were in a facility where you're looking at really having a high fraction of non reactive phosphorus, that's where you're going to have to start looking for these solutions, even if it does take more energy, more cost, more input into it. At the level of a large scale wastewater treatment facility, so a large municipal, it's probably not going to be an efficient choice at this point. So if you're looking at more of a small scale, a little bit more of a niche operation where you have this issue, then I think you might be able to make some of the economics shake out a little bit better.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that, Brooke. I appreciate your taking the time. I'll be interested in what comes out of this research next.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks. Bye.